Welcome back to Harbour Unboxed, part 2 June Q&A. We're still in June?
I think so.
Good. All right, phew. Questions. We have answers, I think. But before we do, today's sponsor spot is brought to you by Gigabyte and their latest range of AMD Radeon RX 9060 XT, 9070 and 9070 XT graphics cards, along with their AMD B850 motherboards. The gaming series utilizes Gigabyte's WindForce cooling system, delivering exceptional thermal performance via a large triple fan cooler featuring Hawks fans, composite copper heat pipes, and a copper base plate. The 9070 XT is also available in the Elite range, offering an even larger cooler, dual BIOS support, and RGB halo effects. All models will pair nicely with one of the many B850 motherboards Gigabyte has on offer, such as the excellent value B850 Eagle Wi-Fi 6E. So for more information, please check the links in the video description.
How do you feel about AMD not sampling 8GB 9060 XTs to most outlets after what they said at Computex about not restricting reviews? So we did a bit of a chat about this on the Harbour Unboxed podcast around the time of the 9060 XTs. I think there was probably a bit of confusion around the sampling process from AMD in terms of some regions. It seems like just people involved weren't really across what was going on. Obviously, we asked for one and got one. I think a few other outlets did, but obviously some outlets didn't. So
yeah, I don't, because I don't really have any insight into exactly how they went about that or whatever. Not sure. I mean, I'm not wrapped that the 8GB card is a product to begin with, but I'm also not wrapped that it is a product to begin with and it's not just sampled. Mm-hmm. So I never like it when companies, and again, I'll back up a little bit here because people always send me, oh, you're just upset because you're not getting free hardware. No, that's a dumb take, for one. But the reason I don't like it when we're talking about motherboards, for example, or whatever it is, when we request a product, I don't like the fact that they're happy to sell you these 8GB cards. You can definitely go and buy them. I don't like that they're happy to sell you those cards, but they sort of want to hide them. And then they're sending out the 16GB cards, prioritizing those because they're actually decent, quite good, giving everyone the impression of this product with the same name, with the 16GB card, and then just selling you the 8GB cards, but keep that on the down low. We don't want to talk about that too much. Like, yeah, that product's not that great, but we're selling it under the same brand. People will buy it, and we're happy to sell it to them, but yeah, we're not happy to have it reviewed. Same thing happens with motherboards all the time. You know, ASUS is a classic for it. I'm covering all the B850 motherboards, for example. I'm currently working on testing all AMD B850 motherboards, and lo and behold, ASUS are like, yeah, the tough gaming, we can send that over, and everything above that we can send. Oh, you've got some Prime boards, what about those? Oh, you're not sampling those, or they're not going to be in your region, and whatever excuse they come up with, and then sure enough, I'm able to buy them. And they're typically not very good, or they don't pass the type of test that we're doing with flying colors. So clearly they know that, and they just don't want them to be included. They want people to focus on the tough gaming, and then if you can't afford that, then just work under the assumption that the primer is also good. So again, that pisses me off that they're happy to sell you these products knowing they're not that great, and that the alternatives at similar price points are probably much better. They just don't want you having that information or knowing that. They just want you to buy the product. So that's what annoys me, not the free products. Do not care about free products. And as I said, we just go and buy them anyway. I spent thousands of dollars on not the best B850 motherboards, that is a little bit frustrating. But again, I'm more frustrated with the fact that they tried to hide them. So first and foremost, that's probably what annoys me about the 8GB card, is if you're going to sample someone the 16GB card, they should also get the 8GB card, because you are selling both of them under the exact same brand.
And without asking. It should be, oh, you're reviewing 9060 XTs, here's both. Not, here's the 16GB card, and then, oh, if you want the 8GB card, you can fill out a form and put it up into a post box on a mountain or something. Or
So don't like that at all. Don't like that at all. I think that's where you can really leave that conversation. But to elaborate further, they did make it very clear to us in the press briefing at Computex that if we want the 8GB card, they are happy to sample it. They're just not doing that by default. So if you want one, make that known and kind of do it now. So I emailed them while we're at Computex, said I want the 8GB card. We're definitely covering it. They replied straight away saying, we'll be sending you out an 8GB card with your 16GB card, and you'll get it early next week. And both of those things turned out to be true. Now, Steve from Gamers Nexus did the same thing and had the same outcome. I've heard from other reviewers that requested it, on X. Hardware Canucks reached out and said they requested one and didn't get it. So that's really all the information I have on that. I didn't follow up with them because I don't really care, because we're not really covering this, but I don't know when they requested it, what AMD said, and how that played out. Linus Tech Tips requested one as well, and they did send them one, except somehow in just classic AMD fashion. And I think this really does explain the whole situation probably a bit more clearly. They sent them a 7700 XT, is my understanding. So LTT got their 9060 XT delivery expecting an 8GB 9060 XT, and somehow they got a 7700 XT. But really, as I don't know, confusing, funny, whatever that is, that's really that's just AMD sampling in general, or AMD product releases in general. Like, that's just such an AMD thing to do, isn't it? It's just send your previous generation product in place of, a product you're meant to be sending. So I wouldn't attribute malice to that, more just AMD things. So we've done videos about AMD marketing and their product releases and stuff in the past. But yeah, I'm not wrapped about it, but we didn't make a video ripping them to pieces about it because we asked for one and they sent us one, and it was really hassle-free. Steve from Gamers Nexus contacted me more recently about this and said, what was your process? And told him, he said his was the same. So he was a bit confused by why some media had the problems they had. But again, AMD stuff, right? I wouldn't even attribute malice to that. I would just say that AMD probably either didn't have enough cards or didn't send them out. I don't know. I really struggle to explain some of the things they've done in the past. Things like the 9700X launch. So many things around that I can't even begin to understand. It's just very confusing, the way they go about things. So just file that under AMD doing AMD stuff. It was nowhere near as bad as NVIDIA, for example, who really actively worked against us to stop us from getting one. At the end of the day, both products are crap and shouldn't be released. So I'm not saying AMD is better than NVIDIA there. They suck equally, I think. There's a quality on the degrees to which these companies suck. So yeah, they both suck. Anything else to add to that?
Nope.
Yeah, I just want to end this one by saying AMD and NVIDIA suck equally. All right, we see this sort of question every now and then, so I'll just deal with it really quickly. What is your experience with coil whine when testing GPUs? And is it a factor when choosing a GPU for your gaming or editing systems? So, coil whine I would typically describe as excessive electrical noise that you experience when under moderate to light to certainly heavy load. So that sort of whining, high-pitched squealing noise whenever the GPU is doing a GPU thing.
Yeah.
I don't attribute it to the sound you'll hear when doing 1000 FPS in a menu, whereas it's that sort of more slight humming noise from it just going absolutely ham, for a lack of a better term.
Yep.
So that's sort of my definitions of coil whine. I have in the past had, from less known brands, let's say graphics cards that have quite bad coil whine, and even motherboards. Generally, the coil whine that I've heard the most is from stuff like fan controllers and things like that have been really high pitched and annoying. But generally speaking, don't run into it all that much. I almost never, like in the last 2 years, I don't think I've had a single instance of coil whine in any computer that I've tested or GPU, motherboard testing. None. All very quiet. Again, it's only till you go like 1000 FPS that you sort of hear that as it's going nuts. And I've, again, spoke about this before. I attribute this largely to the local power source or how clean your power is. And I say that because I have one sort of anecdotal evidence story that I can point to. I built a system for a friend and we set it up here. I think it had this was back in the RTX 2080 days. It was a 2080, worked really well here. He was playing Doom, went home, and the thing just screamed. It was super annoying for him. He lived in quite a sort of older area, let's say, not the best infrastructure and all that, very aging. And And yeah, really loud. So he said to me, oh, something's going wrong with it. You know, it might be dying. I'll have to bring it back and get you to look at it. So he brought it back here. We fired it up and he starts playing. He's like, this is weird. It was dead silent, no noise at all. Took it back home, really loud again. And we ended up getting a UPS with some, whine filtering and all that sort of stuff for him. And that solved the problem. So it can be the quality of the electrical incoming signal, how well your PSU deals with that. I think he had a relatively old, not particularly amazing PSU as well. I am by no means an expert on this stuff. Very crude, basic understanding of how it all works. So not a power supply expert, not a UPS expert or anything like that. But I do run all of my PCs through power stations with UPS functionality, even the test systems. And yeah, just I never encounter it. For whatever reason, I just don't encounter it. I can certainly hear it when it happens. It's bloody annoying, so I understand why people don't like it. But the last time I had it was about 3 years ago. I think it was a case with a fan controller. It was actually the little fan controller on the back. And it took me so long to work out what the hell it was. I actually ended up changing the motherboard. It was still there, and I'm like taking crazy pills. And then I realized as soon as I disconnected the fan controller, it just went away completely. So there was a resistor or something in there that was causing the problem. So yeah, that's why we don't really talk about coil whine much. Like, just don't have a problem. Do you have much?
No, I don't use my test system through UPS at the moment, but I've never had an issue with coil whine really. I live in sort of a newer area in terms of infrastructure, so that could be part of it. But yeah, not really an issue for me, at least with modern components and stuff like that.
All right. Is RDNA 3 already the worst aged GPU architecture of the last decade or two? Considering what we now know, would it change the prices at which you think it would have represented good value? Well, I don't think it would have changed the prices back then, because the prices that we set, like we were saying, a 20% discount relative to the GeForce GPUs, and that was based on the features that the GeForce GPUs at the time had, which hasn't changed.
I guess like those older GeForce cards can now use DLSS 4, whereas the AMD cards can't use FSR 4. But we didn't know that at the time. So I guess it's like, in hindsight, if we had known something like that, would we go back and change the value? I mean, I guess part of it is like a lot of the cards weren't great value to begin with. So even in that scenario where it was a better features discussion back when the cards launched, even then it wasn't great value, a lot of those models.
Because we didn't recommend the XTX, did we? We were like, if you're going to...
buy the 4080, and then the 7900 XT, obviously not.
Terrible.
7800 XT was like, maybe. 7700 XT at launch needed to be cheaper. The RX 7600 as well was too expensive, and then the XT model came later.
So we only really recommended the 7900 XT when it got heavily discounted. And we're basically like, if you can get it for around $700, pretty good deal, which I think still holds true to this day, relative to what it was competing with. But most of the cards weren't great value, and we weren't that excited about anyway. I think, again, it was really the 7900 XT and then the 7700 XT, once that was heavily discounted, became pretty good value as well, because it was competing with a 4060 Ti. So
yeah, that's right. I mean, I think if you're talking about like the architecture, I think this question is very true in terms of it's basically immediately become obsolete now that the 9000 series is available, mostly because of things like FSR 4 support, which you obviously can use on RDNA 4. You can't use it on RDNA 3, which is different to the GeForce GPUs, which do support, well, for a start, they already supported a better, more viable upscaling solution in DLSS 2/3, and now you can also use them with DLSS 4, whereas every old AMD card can't use their new technologies. So from that sense, I mean, it's pretty rare that we've seen a card like that become significantly less usable so quickly. Even when we go back to like RDNA 1, because a lot of people bring up, the 5700 XT not supporting ray tracing, not supporting the latest DirectX 12 features. And while that's probably hurting those cards now in a few select titles, there was a long period of time where that was a very good quality card. Was I think with RDNA 3, it's like, right now, today, I would find it almost impossible to recommend someone actually buy one of those cards. I think, first of all, RDNA 4 models are actually quite reasonable. So they've come to the market, they've got reasonably good value. And then, they support these features that the old models don't. Whereas if you saw like a 4070, for example, on a decent discount that made it make sense against the 50 series models, you'd be like, okay, well, I don't really want like I don't need multi-frame generation. It's basically a 50 series product minus a few of those features that aren't essential. Whereas to me, I think FSR4 is pretty essential. Like a lot of resolutions, I would not want to be using FSR3 for today's games, especially games that now rely on upscaling. So I don't know, in some sense, like it has aged quite badly in that sense. But then again, we were talking about earlier, right? Like it's aged from a position where it wasn't ever that amazing, which is why I think they struggled last generation quite a bit. So again, like if it was a case where we had overwhelmingly recommended these models from top to bottom of the stack, and then like 2 years later it turns out they can't use any of the great new features, they're basically obsolete in that front, I think that would sting a lot more. We would have been recommending models that people might have been better off with a GeForce card, but
I mean that sort of thing can happen at any point with a new generation, so
that is true.
You don't have a crystal ball, so if they're good value at the time, they're good value. But yeah, it's the same thing with like the CPUs and stuff we've seen with like how the AM4 socket played out, for example. Early on, you just didn't know how good it was going to be, which is why, B350 motherboards weren't particularly good because you just weren't, So anyway.
Yeah, and I think there's been times when obviously there's been like 10 series which didn't support ray tracing or DLSS, moved to 20 series, but then while the 20 series did support those new features, which theoretically would have done the same thing, made the 10 series instantly obsolete, it wasn't until a lot further into that product's life cycle where things like DLSS and ray tracing were usable to some extent. Whereas I think, again, with RDNA 4, FSR4 has been available to use in a reasonable number of games right from the get-go. So it's not like we're sitting a couple of years after this talking about, isn't FSR4 good now? Like at the time, but now, it's a really good quality feature. It's kind of straight away. And then on top of that, they provided all those other benefits, better ray tracing support, better video encoding. They really did try fix a lot of those feature deficits that they had in a way that we probably haven't seen. Like the gap from features from one gen to another is probably as large as we've seen from any of the GPU brands.
So I guess then knowing what we know now, so we were saying at least 20% cheaper, and it was proven that it really had to be at least 30% cheaper for people to actually buy the higher end products over the GeForce parts. But knowing what we know now, if we were able to go back and say, okay, so within 2 years or whatever, let's say we're talking about the launch of the product, 2.5 years, there's going to be a much better upscaling technology that won't be available on these cards, but they will be available for future Radeon cards and current GeForce GPUs. So that being the case, how do we adjust our 20%, I guess is the best way to answer this question.
Yeah, that's right. So I think, first of all, we already now know based on the retail evidence that the 20% wasn't enough for general buyers, right? So while we might have recommended it, generally people just disagreed with that based on the evidence of the discounts that we actually saw in the market and when people started to buy the cards at the discount.
Yeah, and we spoke directly with retailers and they gave us like essentially confidential for them, like sales data, and they showed us very clearly that when AMD achieved a 30% discount, the stock started really flying. And when it came back to 20%, it slowed right down. And if it went below 20%, essentially the tap was turned off. So we know that for a fact. Like this isn't us trying to look at like Amazon sales or work it out or whatever. We've heard directly from the retailers that is exactly what was happening.
Yeah, so I think that would have to be the starting point for RDNA 3 back then. And again, it depends, right? Because
like 30% is a big discount.
30% is a big discount. And you've also got the issue of like, okay, well, at a 30% cost per frame sort of discount, now you're talking about, can the AMD card run native when a GeForce card would be using upscaling? And I know even with DLSS 4, quality upscaling may be better quality than native rendering on the AMD card. So that's a tough comparison you'd have to make there as well. It depends on the games and resolution, of course. And, native rendering on AMD isn't that bad. It still looks pretty good in a lot of games. So it's a very complicated topic there. So yeah, I mean, 30% is a big discount. And again, it depends on the sorts of games you play. For multiplayer games, it's a different discussion to single player games. Depends on the performance tier as well. That said, these days, upscaling from low resolutions is much better than it's ever been. So, yeah, it's pretty complicated. I mean, I think, what was it? A $500, $550 4070 versus like, it was about $500 for a 7800 XT, maybe a little lower. That was a key battleground. And that wasn't exactly 30%, was it? So, yeah, they probably would have had to been quite a bit cheaper across the product stack, I would have thought. Certainly around that starting at 30% or higher level in hindsight. So, yeah, not great from AMD on that front, but good to see some improvements this generation. And yeah, it's unfortunate for people that did buy the RDNA 4 cards that things like FSR4 aren't available. So,
RDNA 3.
RDNA 3, sorry.
Yeah.
Yes, FSR4 is not available there. So,
yeah, it's another thing that makes it difficult to recommend Radeon GPUs moving forward. Like we keep saying, they need to build on every generation. They sort of need to do that while not killing the previous generation.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah, so I think right now, I think it's very, like I said earlier, it's very clear that you would struggle to recommend any of those models, especially sort of like unless they're so unreasonably cheap. And to be fair, a lot of them don't exist in the market anymore. But if you could buy a 7800 XT today, it would have to be like ludicrously cheap to recommend over a card that supports the better feature set.
Yeah, it's disappointing.
But that's what happens when AMD doesn't invest in things like, the AI cores. They're slow to those sorts of things, so that's what happens. What's going on with the Intel Core Ultra CPUs? After some price drops, no apparent overheating issue, and improved performance, especially in games from what I've heard, are these CPUs now finally worth buying compared to Zen 5? Or is the upgradability on AMD's platform still so big that it's not worth investing in Intel?
Yeah, this is something I've been thinking about quite a bit recently, and I want to get back to some CPU testing. Obviously, we've just gone through all these new GPUs, and we're still struggling to get all that stuff out of the way. So the CPU testing has been pushed to the side, and I wanted to keep seeing how the Arrow Lake CPUs were progressing. There have been some updates, though I don't think anything's radically improved gaming. I think there's been some minor improvements, and there's a few new overclocking options and stuff that can help, but they're overclocking options. So while I think the situation has improved a bit, it's not improved considerably. And Intel always said they would contact us if there was any noteworthy uplifts to gaming. We've not heard anything from them, so it's either an epic fail on their behalf if that's the case. But I have been watching content from others, and it seems pretty small performance gains there. Really, I think where the bigger improvements probably needed to happen was with the pricing of the CPUs. But again, we've sort of had this conversation, and it's really difficult at this point in time to recommend, or just even myself imagine, investing in an Intel platform, because whether you're upgrading or building a new computer, the result is much the same. You need to buy a new motherboard, new memory, and the processor. So if you've got to invest in those three things, you're looking at the new Core Ultra stuff, or you're looking at the AM5 stuff. And either one of those sees you invest in all three of those things. The advantage of the AMD stuff is generally a little bit more efficient, probably not an advantage that most people care about. And there's two different top discussions here. We're talking about productivity or gaming. So if you're talking about gaming, it's pretty easy to recommend AM5 for a few reasons. One of them being they have the X3D CPUs that just wipe the floor with anything Intel has right now. That's if you want real premium gaming. And you don't necessarily need to buy into that right now. Again, we saw this play out with AM4. You can buy a Ryzen 5 CPU for like $130. You can buy a B series motherboard now for about $100, and some good quality DDR5 memory for I think about $80. So you're looking at just over $300 there for a really powerful platform with all manner of upgrade potential, like 7800 X3Ds. Can you pick one of them up cheap on the secondhand market in years to come? 9800 X3D, Zen 6. There's so much to play out there. So there's some unknowns. There are some, more importantly, known factors. So there's some known quantities there that are great. So plenty of viable options, plenty of flexibility, and it looks to be sort of a replay of what we saw on AM4. Maybe not as glorious as AM4, but still pretty great compared to the alternatives. And that's the problem, the alternative. So we know that the current Intel platform's dead. There's maybe there's keeps on and off rumors of a refresh, which means nothing. Refreshes aren't a viable upgrade for those people who are already on the platform. It's just a way to try and incentivize new people to cycle into the platform. generally pretty unsuccessfully. Probably just helps like people sell notebooks and pre-built systems and stuff like that because it has a new generation of Intel processor or whatever. So yeah, I'm sitting here, I'm thinking for gamers, let's start with, if you've got to invest in those three new things, what argument am I putting forth to say to gamers, invest in Intel, buy a Core Ultra processor? Like, off the top of your head, what argument can you make?
I think the only way I would do it is if I was getting so much more performance from the get-go on the platform with no upgrades that I wouldn't need to upgrade on AMD. So if I was willing to spend, let's say, $150 or $200 on the CPU, and Intel was just offering me so much more, so I'd never had to consider buying an X3D processor or something like that, then I would go, okay, well, you know, tossing it up, I'm getting more price to performance now, don't really need to upgrade, therefore I guess Intel makes sense. But if they weren't doing that and they were just offering slightly more performance for the same money or even the same performance, then there's just really no way I would consider that.
So we've talked about it before, it's one of two things. If you're offering 9800X 3D levels of performance and that puts you well ahead of your competitor, then, which is historically, if we wind back multiple years at this point, that was Intel. You know, 8700K, for example, much faster than a 2700X. So whenever we did our top 5 best CPU recommendation type things, we're always like, if you want no compromise, peak performance, it has to be Intel. You can't even consider AMD. AMD is your budget, too hard to pass up almost type deal. And so that's it. You either offer unrivaled performance or a value factor that the more budget conscious shopper just can't resist, like the 2700X, which I think got down to like $140 or something at the time, which was less than half the price of the Core i7. So it was hard to go past. Intel's doing neither of those things. They're nowhere near the top gaming performance, and they're not really better in terms of value. So I was having a bit of a look. We might as well talk about this before we get to the productivity side of things. So the best value CPU right now is the 265KF, which is it's $250 right now on Newegg. I think it got to $230 on Amazon, and that's a pretty good CPU. When it comes to gaming, it's roughly the equivalent, though, of a Ryzen 5 7600X, which is $180. So if you're talking about gaming performance, you know, you can get a 7700X, which will be generally a little bit better or thereabouts, and you're splitting hairs either way. I don't really want to argue which one's faster for gaming because it's somewhat irrelevant. They're similar, but the AMD CPU has the option of being swapped out with a 7800X 3D, which is much faster, or a 9800X 3D, which is faster again, or whatever the Zen 6 equivalent ends up being, very likely anyway. So there is, again, more flexibility there. If you buy a 265K KF, that's it. You've bought your motherboard and your CPU, and if you want to change the CPU, you're going to need a new motherboard. And
it's more expensive, the CPU.
Yes, it's a little bit more expensive, yeah. But at $250, it's certainly more expensive than a 7600X.
Yes, that's not doing anywhere near
enough.
Well,
it's still $50 more than a 7700. You can buy a Ryzen 7 7700 for $200 on the dot. So in terms of gaming, unless you guys in the comments have some sort of angle I should explore, because I want to do some updated CPU testing and recommendations. So I will be updating my knowledge, let's say, on the Intel stuff and getting a bit more familiar with the improvements and changes they have made, outside of just looking at other people's content. So let me know if I'm overlooking something or I'm missing something. But for gaming, I'm really failing to come up with any reasons for why it would make sense to go with a Core Ultra platform. Now, productivity is a bit more complicated, or it's not really. I think in terms of productivity, the Intel stuff is quite good. So the 265KF, again, $250, 8P cores, 12E cores. It's generally faster than a 7900X for productivity. And as I said, though, for gaming, similar to a 7600X. So the 7900X is more like $330. So that's a fairly big premium. Of course, you don't get the upgradability and all that sort of stuff, so you have to trade that off. But I think for productivity, you can make an argument for a discounted 265KF. The 285K is still like pretty crap, $580 US. I think that's way too expensive for what that part is. And really the rest of the lineup, like for some reason the 245K F is $285. So
that makes no sense.
That makes no sense. Intel needs to be way more aggressive with a lot of these prices. Like the 225, so it's just simply the 225, that's $250. And that's just 6 P cores with 4 E cores.
Why would you buy that when you can buy a 265K unless you really need the graphics?
So again, same price, but then the cheapest thing they offer right now is $215. Again, 6 P cores, 4 E cores. That's the 225F. So just the integrated graphics deleted. But that's more than a 9600X. Not that I recommend you get the well, it's only $10 more than the 7600X. So it's kind of like whatever at that point. I guess you might as well get it.
All right, not great.
So there's one CPU there I could argue for productivity. There's really no CPUs from Intel that I can argue for gaming. But yeah, I'm keen to hear from you guys what you think of the small pricing adjustments Intel's made. One rather big pricing adjustment for that 265KF. And yeah, I'll do some updated testing and investigation in the near future.
Do you think it's more damaging to AMD to launch a product with too high of an MSRP and have it drop later, for example, the 7900 XT, or to launch with too low of an MSRP and not be able to meet that MSRP, for example, the 9070 XT?
Yeah, well, if I have to pick one of those things as to what's more damaging, clearly launching it at a high MSRP and then dropping it's just unexplainably dumb. That doesn't make sense. So that's bad. I don't like either of these options. I think announcing the correct price and launching at the correct price would be optimal.
Yeah, you don't say. Yeah.
Like saying the 7900 XT has to be $900 and you can't do it cheaper than that, and then like 2 months later making it $750 to $700. That's dumb. Not a good look. You should have started there. But then saying the 7900 XT can be $600. But then selling it for $700 is less than ideal as well. But that would be preferable. But either option comes with its own set of consequences. I think playing the game like NVIDIA has done traditionally and sort of lying and coming in above what you say is the way to do it in terms of a business sense for sure. The other way makes no sense for anybody. Because if you say the MSRP is $900 and then you get wrecked because the product shouldn't be $900 and then you drop it to $700, it's really not a win for anyone because when it drops down to $700, a lot of people still think it's a crap product and they should avoid it. So it's just deleted from their wish list, essentially.
Yeah, they see the reviews. They don't look at follow-up content. Follow-up content isn't made, and so they just ignore it, which is fair enough. Like, not blaming those people for not watching extra content. It's up to the manufacturer to get it right from the start.
So that's pretty much that, really. But yeah, ultimately, just be honest with the price. But then if your competitor isn't being honest with the price, so your competitor says, well, it's a $500 product, but they really charge $900, and then you come in and say, well, our product's $600, and they really charge $600. But then the reviews are sort of like, well, it's $100 more than the competitor. The competitor sure is $900 now, but it'll come down. It just gets messy. So NVIDIA's the market leader. They make up the rules. And in a lot of ways, AMD has to follow those rules. Because if they don't, they get wrecked. So
I think a part of this as well, there's kind of two ways the MSRP side of this question goes. There's they advertise a price and then they sell it for a higher price indefinitely. So if they said the 9070 XT was $600 and for the rest of time it's a $700 product, they've obviously lied about the price. And that's bad. And we've seen that with, NVIDIA's done that with products. The 2080 Ti comes to mind as the first thing I can think of because that was advertised at $1,000 but was $1,200 as the real price. That was the Founders Edition price for forever.
Looking back, I thought $1,200 was the real price. I forget. Yeah,
it was announced at $1,200 for the Founders Edition and $1,000 for the entry-level partner cards.
Yeah, okay.
But it just was never $1,000. And that's why you've completely forgotten it was that price. So that's bad. That is just a lie and should not happen. I think, though, there is some degree with these launches where the market does set the price. So if a card is highly in demand, if your competitor is selling for too high of a price, then naturally the price will go up because people will want to buy exclusively the better value card. It'll be in high demand. There won't be enough supply. And so then it will be sold for a higher price. And that's exactly what happened when the 5070 Ti was announced for $750. The actual price was $900. AMD comes in with the $600 card, huge gap to $900. Naturally, people are very excited about it, try to buy it. The price starts to go up to more like $750 because that restores the value difference based on NVIDIA's card being inflated. Now, over time, if that price comes down to being $600 again, and NVIDIA's 5070 Ti has come down more to $750, not necessarily in the US, but worldwide, the MSRP is more achievable, that is going to cause AMD's card to come down. I think if within a few months, at some point, you can actually buy the card at $600, the strategy of having the card advertised at a certain price, for a period of time it's available at an inflated price because of market factors, then it comes down. I think that's clearly better for everyone than an option where they're kind of misleading in the other way, where it's really bad value, no one's interested in the product. Like, yes, in ideal world, AMD makes exactly the right number of cards for everyone at launch. Everyone can buy it at the MSRP. Everyone's super happy. But across the history of graphics cards, that has really never been a thing for products that are good and in demand. If you make a good product for a period of time, it is not available at the price it's advertised. That sucks, not great. But so long as at some point in the future and a reasonable amount of time within the generation, not like a year later or 2 years later like an RTX 3060, so long as at some point you can buy it for the advertised price, I think that's clearly better and is not as misleading. Because I don't want to advocate like AMD should play the game because NVIDIA just lies all the time about pricing. And the degree to which NVIDIA lies is kind of exaggerated at times as well. Again, worldwide right now, a lot of NVIDIA's cards are actually at the advertised price. So you don't really want to be sitting here saying, yeah, NVIDIA should lie about everything, so therefore AMD should lie about everything. But so long as, they're doing stuff that makes sense on a business sense, and ultimately consumers, if they do wait an appropriate, reasonable amount of time, they are getting the card at the advertised price, I think that's fine. Not great, not terrible.
Almost a year ago, there was a lot of conversations about how Windows 24H2 would increase your FPS compared to previous versions. Looking back, how does performance in Windows now compare to last year? Nothing's really changed since last year. Basically, what we discovered back then holds true today. So 23H2 was kind of a hot mess. Not saying 24H2 hasn't been its own sort of hot mess, it's just been a different one. But there was heaps of Ryzen-related performance issues with 23H2 and probably previous versions as well. We didn't really realize how much Windows 11 was holding back Ryzen performance. The performance jump they got from 24H2 was quite remarkable, something we never really expected to be possible. And since then, a lot of other hardware Canucks, for example, reporting when they were testing, I think it was the Zen 5 CPUs, by having updated all their results. Because initially they'd said there wasn't a performance uplift, but then they did all their testing and they're like, actually, the performance uplift is quite substantial. So Ryzen's really pushed ahead of Intel. And I think everyone's pretty much seen that now. It's why parts like the 9800X3 are so impressive. So we saw that holds true today. There are some instances when compared to Windows 10 where Windows 11 is now faster, and other instances where it's similar or slower. I think it depends on a few things and how they're configured and all that sort of stuff. But it's pretty much what we discovered back then holds true today. What current motherboard brands do you trust recommending to others? None of them really, to be perfectly fair. They all have their ups and downs at times. ASRock released some really nice AM5 motherboards that tested really well in our testing, but then they had the problems with burning up CPUs and stuff like that, which was due to PBO settings and whatnot. So that's behind them now, but it's a bit disappointing because we did recommend some of their boards as being quite good, and they are good boards, just poorly configured BIOS in that sense. But I wouldn't sit here and go, well, MSI motherboards are always great, because we have actual evidence on the channel that that's not always the case. And generally speaking, MSI motherboards have been very good over the last few years. We haven't Don't think there's any examples we can point to that were necessarily bad. But, Asus, they have some great boards. They have some not great boards. Gigabyte, the same story. ASRock, the same story. So there's no brand where I'd say always buy Gigabyte or always buy Asus. I would say research the specific board that you're buying. It's the same thing with monitors, right?
Yep.
You're not going to say always buy an AOC monitor because they're always great value or whatever. They'll have some crappy ones and some not crappy ones.
Yep, that's right.
Do your research. All right, so that is going to do it for part 2 of the June Q&A. Lots more questions, some confusing, some were probably answered to a satisfactory level. Probably the ones I did. Tim did an all right job, I guess.
All right.
We'll have a part 3. We got part 3, don't we?
I think so. There's a couple of other interesting questions I want to get to, so we'll chuck those in.
More mid-level answers from Tim, I'm sure, but...
Q&A's cancelled.
Yeah. Anyway, I don't really know where we're going with this. Like, subscribe, do the YouTube stuff if you want. And yeah, that's a wrap on this one. I'm your host, Steve.
I'm your host, Tim.
See you next time.